We are going to dive into our first gospel series. So I think I looked at the podcast, and I think this will be the 30th sermon in the series, which means we have been, about 4 a month, so about 7 months in the first gospel series. We've been going through the Old Testament. That's kind of the name we've given the Old Testament is the first gospel. The idea is that God is always good. He didn't just start being good when Jesus showed up, but that he's been good from the very beginning of time. That's how the story starts. God saw all that he created, and behold, it was very good. He's got this kind of goodness that is the foundation of the world. And he's good throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. If you read the Old Testament with a careful eye, you'll see that all of the stereotypes and all of the kind of preconceptions about an angry God just aren't true. That he is giving and merciful and kind and loving in the Old Testament as well. And he's working goodness and he's working redemption back into the world, even when we make plenty of mistakes along the way. So our goal in this series has been to see the goodness of God throughout the entirety of the Old Testament Scripture, so that when we get to Jesus in Matthew, it makes sense. We're sort of singing off the same song sheet. Jesus didn't show up and suddenly start singing a different song. He just continued the song that God has been writing from the beginning of time. But another sort of side goal of this series has been to tell the story of the Old Testament well. We have this kind of, I think at least the way I grew up in church, I had these sort of episodic images of the Old Testament. Like I would hear a story here and there. You know, you hear about Noah's Ark, or you hear about David and Goliath, or you hear about the binding of Isaac, and they sort of all kind of existed out in this nebulous kind of fantasy land. It's almost like Narnia, like it happened in kind of nowhere, and they're just these disconnected stories. I was talking with my uncle on the phone the other day, and my uncle has taken it upon himself to be our family historian, and he's writing kind of the family history, going as far back as he can trace the lines. And he just wanted to talk to me on the phone yesterday to say, hey, as the next generation coming up, like, what do you want to know? And I told him, I said, context would be really helpful, because my whole life I had my grandma and my mom and my aunts and uncles telling me stories. And it was kind of like the Old Testament, where they sort of were these like little episodic stories, like funny anecdotes or stuff that happened, you know, when you lived on the ranch or when you lived over here. But I don't actually know how it all fits into the grand narrative. And I think that's the same way we treat the Old Testament sometimes. We have these stories that exist kind of out there, but we don't pay attention to the fact that there is one story that all of these fit into. And when you know the context, the stories even make more sense. And you understand that this is part of God's redemption history in the world. As a matter of fact, I had this Bible back in the day. I can't find it anymore, but it actually had a timeline of the Old Testament, which was really helpful to see the Old Testament laid out kind of chronologically to see where these stories fit in, but it had it alongside a timeline of the world. I thought that was really interesting because, you know, it had this happened about the same time the Great Wall of China was being constructed, and it's like, okay, that's so helpful to realize that this happened in the real world. Like the planet that we're all living on. It's not imaginary, it's not make-believe, it didn't happen in Narnia or somewhere else. It happened in the real world in real time. So one of the things we're looking to do is tell the story chronologically so you can see where all this stuff fits in. You can see where the book of Psalms fit in that we spent 4 weeks in, you know, a month or so ago. You can see where Proverbs and the wisdom literature fits in. So we've been kind of telling this story. And to this point in the story, we are in what we call the United Kingdom of Israel. So you remember that Israel sort of came out of Egypt and were promised this land flowing with milk and honey that God was going to give them. It was known as Canaan at the time. They took occupation of the promised land under a guy named Joshua. The different tribes were all given sort of a different territory, and then each of them sort of had these tribal leaders or tribal chiefs that ruled over those territories. We call them judges. So the time of Judges took place where Israel had moved into the promised land, but there were still 12 sort of loosely connected tribes ruled over by different people. Then they decided they wanted a king so they could be like the rest of the nations around them. Yahweh warned them. He said, you don't want to do this. This is going to be a bad decision, but they did it anyway. And so we enter into a season known as the United Kingdom, where 3 kings in succession, Saul, David, and Solomon, ruled over the entirety of the 12 tribes. And this United Kingdom lasted about 100 years. And we talked about David and his biggest contribution to the Bible being the Psalms. And we talked about Solomon and the Proverbs and wisdom literature. And now we're going to move on past Saul, David, and Solomon to the next kind of phase of the history of Israel, which is what we're going to call the divided kingdom. Okay, so I want to tell just a quick history of the divided kingdom, how we get here, and then we'll dive into our story for tonight. Just want to give some context for the story that we're telling, okay? So Saul, David, and Solomon ruled for roughly 100 years. Okay, so 3 generations, roughly 100 years of Israel's history. When Solomon died, he had a son. His oldest son was a guy named Rehoboam. Now, when Rehoboam was proclaimed king in Judah, which is in the south, he still needed to consolidate power in the north. You have to realize that at this point, the dynasty is only 3 generations old. And it's not a very big piece of land, but it was still fairly diverse. I mean, imagine if you've traveled the United States. We're a much bigger country by land mass. But if you go to different parts of the country, you'll find that there are different cultures wherever you go, right? If you travel even just a state over, you'll find that things are very different in Nevada or Arizona than here. And if you go all the way into the south, things are extremely different, or into the northeast or wherever you happen to be. And that's why often you'll see that we have political differences as a country as well, right? Because there are just different concerns in different parts of the country, different things that people care about in different places. And the same was true in Israel. It was a different kind of community. So up in the north, the concerns of the people there were different than those in the south. Now, all of the kings, at least when we have David's dynasty, so David, Solomon, and then all of Solomon's kind of descendants after him, were from the south. They were from the tribe of Judah. So they represented the southern kingdoms, but they had different needs and different kind of culture and different worldview than the northern kingdoms. So what would happen is when Saul, David, or Solomon, when any of the 3 of them were proclaimed king in the south, they had to go to the north and get the approval of the people in the north as well. They had to travel to the northern part of the country, where they would meet with representatives from the northern tribes who would then affirm their kingship. And that was kind of how they created the United Kingdom. Is the South agrees, they sort of put forward a ruler, they go to the North stamps the ruler with their stamp of approval, and now we have a king over the entire country. Saul had to do this, David had to do this, Solomon had to do this, and when Rehoboam became king, he's now a 4th generation king. It's still not stable enough where you can just sort of anoint a king in the south and he can assume power for the entire country. So he had to travel to the north to meet with representatives of the 10 northern tribes who would then kind of affirm his kingship. And the Bible tells us that they were ready to do that. When Rehoboam traveled to the north, they were ready to do that. They just had one concern. And basically their concern was this. They said to him, life under your father Solomon was really difficult for us. Okay, what that meant was, if you remember, Solomon was a wise king. There was no war when Solomon was king, but he was a great builder. And to build all of his big projects, what did he have to do? He had to tax the people heavily, and then he had to conscript them into labor. So he had to force them into labor to build these big buildings. And a lot of the buildings he were building, the temple and other big projects, were where? In the south. So here we have the northern kingdom, which we'll find out in a second was the wealthier of the kingdom. The northern part of the country was paying for most of these building projects that they would never receive the benefits of. We're having to send goods and services and people south to build this stuff because they had agreed on a king and he was taxing them heavily. So when Rehoboam shows up in the north, they say, your father made life difficult on us. What are you going to do? Can you lighten the burden a little bit? Now Rehoboam did something fairly smart here. He said, you know what I'm going to do? I need to talk with my advisors before I give you an answer. Okay, so he didn't want to just give an answer off the top of his head. He wanted to talk to the advisors he had around him and say, what should we do here? So he pulled together 2 different groups of advisors. One of them were old men who had been his father's advisors. And he says to them, what do you think? And they basically say, yeah, your father was tough on these guys. If you want them to love you, lower the taxes, lower the conscription rates, and tell them you're going to take it easy on them. And you'll have them eating out of your hand. They'll love you. They'll affirm your kingship. It's going to be great. He heard that, and then he went to these other advisors who were younger. They were his friends. And they're brash, kind of confident, arrogant, and they said, no. Tell them you're going to make things way more difficult. Tell them you think my father was bad. You have no idea what I'm going to be like. So Rehoboam decides to go with the advice of his younger, kind of brash friends. And he goes to these representatives of the 10 kingdoms. You know what he said to them? This is literally in the Bible. He says, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. He beats you with whips, I will beat you with scorpions. Okay, it's just like this massive threat. In other words, you thought things were bad under my father. You have no idea what I'm going to do. So he took this kind of hard-nosed approach. And what do? They chased him out of town. They refused to make him the king. They chased him out of town, and they sent a message to Egypt, where a guy named Jeroboam Not my fault that these guys have almost identical names, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. A guy named Jeroboam was living in exile. He was one of Solomon's advisors that fell out of favor, and Solomon sent him to Egypt to live in exile. He was from the north. So the north sent a message to Egypt saying, Jeroboam, come back home. He came back home, and they anointed him king in the north. So we refuse to recognize your king in the south. We now have our own king, and at this point we have a fractured kingdom. So within a couple of days of Solomon's son inheriting the throne, he has managed to lose the entire kingdom. So now we have the northern and southern kingdoms from this point on through the rest of the biblical story until, I don't want a spoiler alert, but until both of them will be conquered by foreign powers. Okay, so the kingdom will never be united again, ever, in the biblical story. The northern kingdom consists of 10 tribes. I'm not going to list them all, but there are 10 tribes up in the north, and we call this Israel now. The southern kingdom only is 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, and we call this the kingdom of Judah. So when we talk about the south, we're going to call it Judah. When we talk about the north, we're going to call it Israel, okay? I'm almost done with the class portion of this, so bear with me, and then we'll get to the biblical stuff. Now, a couple distinctives from the different kingdoms. The northern kingdom was the wealthier of the two. And the reason for this is the trade routes ran through the north. So most of the trade at this time was coming from the east, from what we call kind of Iran and Iraq. Back then it was known as Mesopotamia. But Mesopotamia, if you guys remember your sort of, I think it's 7th grade history, right? You learn 6th, 7th grade history, you learn about the Fertile Crescent, which is this area of good farmland that ran basically from Mesopotamia north through Lebanon and then back down the coast in Israel. And in the middle between those things is just desert. So whenever anybody wanted to travel from Mesopotamia from the east to the west, they didn't go straight across the desert because that was death. If you travel across the desert, you're going to die. So what you did is you traveled north through Mesopotamia, kind of over the top, and then back down again from north to south into Israel. In other words, you traveled through the northern kingdom first if you wanted to access the south, which meant that the north controlled the trade routes. So they could tax the roads, have kind of toll roads and tariffs and all this sort of stuff in the north, and that made them very wealthy. So they were the much more economically stable of the two. However, politically they were kind of a mess. We're going to see that in their short history, they're going to have a bunch of different dynasties. I don't think any dynasty in the north lasted more than 3 generations. Lots of political assassinations, lots of intrigue, lots of kind of chaos. And one of the things they're most famous for is their sort of idolatry. So in the north, Jeroboam comes back. He's received a promise from God that if he can stay faithful to God, that his line will rule over the north like David's rules over the south. He can't do that. Within 1 generation, he's already forgotten about who God is and put idols in different temples in the north. Okay. Now the southern kingdom, much less economically prosperous, but more politically stable. They'll have one dynasty from beginning to end, which is the dynasty of David. That's based on the promise of God. I promise that one of your descendants will sit on the throne of Judah. Okay? And then, religiously, they're a little bit better. But that's kind of like saying they had a little bit less cancer than the north. It's not much of a compliment. Okay? So things were still a mess in the south, and we're going to hear about that. Okay, that's kind of a history lesson. Now, most of the biblical story from here on out is going to focus on the southern kingdom, on Judah, for obvious reasons. When Jesus comes along, he is from the tribe of Judah. So the story, as we know it, will focus mainly on the south. But there are stories out of the north that we hear. There are prophets who are prophesying in the north. And the one we're going to read tonight is one of the most famous stories from the northern kingdom. It is in 1 Kings 17. We'll put it up on the screen if you want to follow along. Okay, are we doing okay so far? That was the lecture portion of tonight, the class portion. Now, our story today, I want to give you a little kind of a list of 3 characters that we're going to talk about. Okay, character number 1 is a guy named Ahab. Ahab is the 7th king of the northern kingdom. He's perhaps most famous for marrying a woman named Jezebel. And when I teach the Old Testament, I always will point out places where, like if you're looking for a good baby name, here's one. This is a place where you don't want them, okay? So steer clear of Ahab and Jezebel if you're looking for baby names. There'll be some other good baby names that we'll run across later in the story, but this is not a place to find them. So Ahab was the 7th king of Israel. He married Jezebel, who was not an Israelite. She was from the city of Tyre. So if you Tyre, Tyre and Sidon. So she was a foreigner. And what they were most famous for is bringing, when Ahab married Jezebel, she brought a whole bunch of friends with her. prophets of Baal and prophetesses of Asherah. So Baal, at least Baal of Tyre, was the storm god that ruled over Tyre. Tyre was a harbor city on the Mediterranean. So they were familiar with shipping, and it was a major port town. So they had a god that sort of ruled over all the storms and that they would pray to keep the sea and the sailors and everybody safe. And that was Baal. There are lots of Baals around the Middle East. If you hear the name Baal, it's not just one god. The name Baal in Hebrew literally means master. And so there's a Baal in Canaan, there's a Baal of the Edomites, there's different Baals all over the place, different lords or masters. Okay, so it means Lord. So Baal from Tyre was the sea god, or the storm god, and he was married to a goddess named Asherah. And when Jezebel married Ahab, she brought with her 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophetesses of Asherah to Israel and installed them in God's land. Okay, so what she was trying to do here, what her and Ahab had partnered together to do, was to make Israel a polytheistic country. Okay, to this point, it was monotheistic, one God, right? Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and all of your soul and all of your strength. This is one of the great contributions that the Old Testament and that the kingdom of Israel made to the world, was monotheism, the idea that there is one God who is over all. But that idea, even back then, was considered to be sort of old-fashioned. It was considered to be a little bit dated, because if you think about it, the idea that there is one God changes the way that we all see ourselves in the world. Okay, most countries in the history of the world, including today, are polytheistic. They believe in many gods. And if you live in a polytheistic culture, you can see how the way that people relate to their gods is very people-centered, okay? Because the reason I have multiple gods is because each god has their own territory. They have their own place where they can do stuff. So Baal of Tyre is the sea god. He's the storm god. So if I need safe shipping, I pray to Baal of Tyre, right? But if I need, let's say I'm a farmer. Let's see, I don't live close to the coast, but I'm a farmer. Well, there's a god who controls the weather and the crops. Or let's say I'm an artist. There's a god who I can pray to for inspiration. So these polytheistic cultures exist because they have gods who meet our needs. And we pick the ones to worship depending on the circumstances of our life, depending on what we're going through. So polytheism, or pluralism, this idea that there are multiple gods out there, is very me-centered. It's what do I need right now? I need money, pray to the money god. I need relationship help, I pray to the God who's kind of the God of love or friendship. I need my crops to grow, so I pray to the God of weather and farming. And I have all these different gods that I can choose from depending on my needs. But then Israel comes along. Yahweh comes along and says, no. There is one. There is one true God above all of them. And to him you give all of your affection. Love him with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. And when monotheism, Yahweh, enters the picture, he takes all of us and draws them to himself. So now it's no longer about me worshiping what I feel like when I feel like it. It's that there is one God, whether I feel like it or not, that is worthy of my worship whether I feel like it or not, that can say yes or no to my needs and my desires based on his sovereignty and his plan for the world. And that idea, even back then, even back in the story of Ahab and Jezebel, was very old-fashioned. It's much more modern to think of gods who serve us. It's much less progressive to think of a God that we all serve, that we worship whether we feel like it or not, whether we get any benefit from him or not, that he is worthy because of who he is. That's the story the Bible tells. And so Jezebel comes in and says, I don't like this. I don't like this Yahweh thing. I don't like this worship him and him only. I don't like the exclusivity of your religion. So I want to bring in more gods that we can all choose from, that we can all worship as needed, that meet our needs, not this one that demands that we serve him and him alone, that we love him and him alone. I don't want that. I want choices. So her and Ahab decided to make this exclusively monotheistic country into a pluralist, polytheistic society. Does that make sense? That was their aim. They're quite successful at it. But they did have opposition. The opposition was from a guy named Elijah. Okay? Now, Elijah was a prophet of God. Now, prophets in the Old Testament, we got to get really clear on what a prophet was. In our mind, a prophet is somebody who tells the future. But that's not what a prophet's job in the Old Testament was. Okay? So, a prophet in the Old Testament was one of 3 governmental authorities. It's sort of like in our country now, we have three different branches of government, right? We have executive, legislative, and judicial. And the idea is that they balance the power of each one. The same was true in the Old Testament. We had kings, prophets, and priests. Priests were responsible for worship in the temple and the tabernacle. Kings were responsible for presiding over the government. And prophets were responsible for making sure that both of them did their jobs well without corruption. So they were sort of a balance to power. The job of a prophet was to speak truth to power. And more often than not, they're not talking about the future, they're talking about the past. So most of the prophecies in the Old Testament are not prophetic words about the future, they're talking about one event in the past, which is Mount Sinai, when God gave the law. Over and over and over again, the prophets are saying, remember who God is. Remember who you are. Remember what he said. Remember what you committed yourself to. Remember the covenant. They're constantly calling God's people back to remember. And then, when they prophesy about the future, it's usually the consequences of not remembering. If you forget who God is, if you fall short of the covenant, then this might happen. Then you might find yourself in this situation. But that's secondary. The primary job of a prophet was to stand up and speak the word of God, speak the law of God, and say, don't forget. And that was Elijah's job with Ahab and Jezebel. You have forgotten who God is. You have forgotten that our job as a country, the reason we even exist as a people, is to love and worship him and show the world who he is. And now you're watering him down with all these foreign gods. You are destroying the very purpose for which he created us. That was Elijah's message to Ahab and Jezebel. And all of that prompted the story that we're going to read today, okay? This big showdown between Ahab and Jezebel. It's in 1 Kings, actually I said 17, it's actually 18, starting in verse 17. So Ahab sees Elijah out on the road, and he says to him, it said, when he saw Elijah, he said to him, is that you, O troubler of Israel? I have not made trouble for Israel, Elijah replied, but you and your father's family have. You've abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now, summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets at Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, how long will you waver between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him. But the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to him, I am only one of the Lord's prophets left. If you read early in the story, Jezebel had a bunch of them executed. It's amazing how often people who kind of are calling for tolerance, this just accept all of these different religions can be some of the most intolerant people, It's like, as long as you are willing to say, hey, anything goes, then anything goes. But the second you claim, no, there is a standard, then you're labeled as intolerant, and Jezebel has them executed. Anyway, so Elijah's saying, I'm one of the only ones left. This is verse 22. But Baal has 450 prophets. So get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, or by lightning is what he's saying, is the Lord, is God. Then all the people said, what you say is good. So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one of the bulls, prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but don't light the fire. So they took the bull that was given to them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. They danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he's a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened." So they shouted louder, and they slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until a time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response, no one answered, no one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." And with these stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. And he dug a trench round it, large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a third time," he ordered, and they did it a third time. And the water ran down the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell on their faces, prostrate, and cried, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Okay, we'll stop there. I love this story. I think it shows how God deals with these places in our heart where we allow other gods space. It shows the way that he shows up in our lives. And I love what Elijah prays there. It says, "Turn their hearts back to you." That's his goal here. He realizes that the hearts of the people have been captivated by all these other gods. And he says, "Lord, turn their hearts back to you. Recapture their love." That's what he's saying here. And he proposes this showdown. He stands up in front of the people and he says, "Here's what we're going to do. You have a problem, and your problem is you are wavering between 2 opinions. In Hebrew, it literally says you are limping between 2 lifestyles. Okay? The picture here is, here's a group of people that worshiped Yahweh on Saturdays, on the Sabbath. They went to temple, they went to tabernacle, they worshiped, they prayed to Yahweh on Saturdays. And then the next day, if they needed something else, they just picked a different god. Whichever one you need today, you just pray to that one. Whatever meets your needs. That's how things work in this polytheistic society. And that's why Ahab comes to Elijah and says, "Oh, there's the troubler of Israel." What he's saying is, why can't you just leave us alone? Why do you have to keep reminding us that there's one God? Why do you have to keep calling us out for our idolatry? Just let us do whatever we want to do. Let us do what feels best to us. Troubler of Israel, you're stirring up trouble. Just let us have whatever gods we want. Worship whenever we want. Why do you have to insist on Yahweh only? Yahweh and Him alone. Now, I have a friend, some of you have met, named Suresh Kumar. He's a pastor and an evangelist in India. And he's talked to me before about how easy it is to get a Hindu to worship Jesus. He says you can do it in a couple of seconds. Because Hinduism is a religion with 33 million gods. So what's one more? You tell him about Jesus, he sounds great. Perfect. I'll put a statue of Jesus right alongside of one of Hanuman, right alongside of Brahma, Perfect. This is great. He can go between the bull and the monkey on my shelf. And he says it's so easy to get a Hindu to worship Jesus until you tell them that he wants the whole shelf. That it's him and him alone, that he takes over from all other gods, that he deserves all of our love, all of our affection, all of our attention, that he tolerates no pretenders, no rivals, that he is one and one only. When you say that, you lose them. I've had a similar experience as a pastor. Been around churches specifically where people, one thing I love about this season in our church is, how do I say this? I've been around churches, and I've loved it, where we've had a sort of dynamic worship. We've had bands that rival any band that you're going to hear out there in the world, And people come in because the music is just so stunning and incredible. And when you walk into a room, it's beautiful. And we're singing these amazing songs to Jesus, and it just gets electric, where you're in a room with 1,000 people that are singing these songs, and you get so many people that walk in and are just swept up in the worship. And I love that. Please don't get me wrong. I love that. Just love to be a part of that. This kind of emotional and overwhelming experience when you're in this room and the music is so good and people are singing so loud and everybody's in, and suddenly your hands are up and you're crying and you don't even know it, and it's awesome, and people will say, I love to worship Jesus. Until he starts to put his finger on things that we don't want him to touch. It's great when the songs are pumping, you know? It's great when it's my favorite band or my favorite preacher or whatever. It's great in that space. But when Jesus sits down quietly and says, okay, I'm really glad you had that experience with me. I was totally there with you. I love that song too. But now I want to talk about your relationships. Or I want to talk about your money habits. I want to talk about the way you spend your free time. I want to talk about your addictions. I want to talk about, God forbid, your politics. Then I'm out, you know? I'm out. Jesus, stay away from this. Because we kind of have some of that sort of pluralist polytheism in us too, where it's like, I'll take Jesus as long as it suits me. He is a great add-on to my life, you know? Like a sprinkle of Jesus on top of anything just makes anything better. But when he asks for more, we start to put up walls. Here's the thing. Our fundamental confession as a church is that Jesus is Lord. Jesus is King. In other words, it's all his. Any room he walks into belongs to him. Any life he claims is his entirely. We don't sprinkle him on anything. Everything he touches is his. That's the way this works. I love, C.S. Lewis has this great picture. He says, imagine yourself as a living house. And God comes in to rebuild that house. And at first, you can understand what he's doing. He's getting the drains right, or he's stopping a leak in the roof. And you knew those jobs needed done, so you're not surprised. But presently, he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and doesn't seem to make any sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is he's building quite a different house than the one you thought of. Throwing up a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage. But he's building a palace because he intends to come and live in it himself. I love that picture because it's kind of how we often treat Jesus. Like, hey, yeah, come into my house. I invite Jesus into my life. I invite him into my heart. But there are all sorts of places where it's like, don't look over there. Just stay out of that. Okay? I need you on Sunday mornings. I need you for a little bit of advice every once in a while. When things get really crazy, really hairy in life, I'll call on you to take the wheel. You know, as Carrie Underwood reminds us. But for the most part, I got this. And Jesus says, no. If I'm coming in, it's my house. It's my house. I take over. I take ownership and I build out of you what I want, what I need. I build you into, as Heather's going to be sharing with her staff tomorrow, the masterpiece that I intend you to be. You're not just going to stay where you are. I have plans for you. Okay? That's what he's doing. He is not one among many. He is the true God. He is the true King. And he comes to take all of our love, all of our attention, all of our affection, and leave none for any other God, leave none for any rival. And so that's what Elijah says. He says, you're wavering between these two. You think you can worship Yahweh on Saturdays and Baal on Mondays, and that's going to be okay. And then you can worship Asherah on Wednesday nights, and whoever else feels like, wherever else you feel like you want to worship, you worship. The people of Israel had it easy under their kings. Anything goes. Just do whatever feels best to you. Do whatever feels right. And Elijah says, no, come on. You're being ridiculous. There's one God. It's either Yahweh or it's Baal. Pick. What he's saying is stop vacillating between the two. Stop limping back and forth between kind of all of these different gods and just pick one. He says, he's saying, I would rather have you reject Yahweh altogether and choose Baal entirely than to continue to give a seventh of your life to Yahweh and think that that's good, think that he's okay with that. Either pick him and be all in, or pick Baal and be all out. But stop pretending. Stop limping back and forth between these two opinions. So we're going to have a showdown right here to see which is the real God. And I love this because he gives Baal home field advantage. He says, this Baal of yours, he's a storm god, yeah? So he controls the lightning. He controls the weather patterns. Okay, perfect. We'll play on his field. We're going to make an offering. We're not going to light it on fire. We're going to call down lightning from the sky. We're going to allow the lightning god, the Baal of the storm, to do his thing and light the sacrifice on fire. You get home field advantage. Yahweh is never known to be the lightning god. Okay, great. So as you see, he says, you go first. I love this. I love kind of every detail of this story. It's just so good. He says, you go first. And they start to, they put their bull out on the altar, and says they start to dance. They start to perform for their God. Make a show for him. And then when he doesn't respond, I love this. There's literal trash talk in the Bible. Elijah starts trash talking him. Maybe he's busy. Maybe he went on a vacation. Just shout louder. You can see him. There's 450 prophets of Baal, 400 prophets of Asherah, all dancing around. And Elijah's over here on the sideline just taunting him. It's hilarious. Shout louder. Maybe he can't hear you. And the picture that the Bible wants us to understand is not, because I think when I read that as a kid, what I thought was, the Bible wants us to understand that Baal's not a real God. I don't think that's the case. I think the Bible is very clear that Baal is a very real spiritual power. So the issue is not that he doesn't exist, it's that Yahweh has him pinned to the mat here. He is preventing him from making any move of any kind. He can't do anything, and Elijah knows it. He knows that God is in complete control of the situation. And so after a while, when their God is not showing up for them, they start to cut themselves. It says, as was their custom, they would cut themselves and bleed themselves on the altar. And this is how idolatry works, isn't it? You pick a God because you think he's going to meet your needs. But pretty soon, after a while, instead of serving you, this God is demanding that you perform for them. And when the performance isn't enough, demanding that you slash yourself and bleed for it. And if you find anybody worshiping another God, that will be the perfect description of their experience. It started out as something that I thought was meeting my needs, that I thought was fulfilling me, but pretty soon I found that I was giving myself entirely to it and receiving nothing in return. I was giving my blood, sweat, and tears to the service of this God, and it was silent. It was mute. It did nothing for me. That's what idolatry is like. As C.S. Lewis says, idols always break the hearts of their worshipers. And eventually, Baal breaks their heart. He doesn't respond because he can't. There's no answer from the heavens. So Elijah finally around dinner time says, it's my turn. And I love what happens next. It says he started by calling them all to himself. So here he's got his countrymen who have been vacillating back and forth between Yahweh and between Baal, between all these different gods. And he says, come around me. And the first thing he does is he rebuilds the altar of God. In other words, he says, we got to get first things first. We have to put God and worship back at the center of our lives. And I can imagine he's telling the story. He called them close around him so he could tell the story, right? He finds 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel, and he places them all around this altar. And I can just imagine him saying, remember that one time, in Exodus, when God led these 12 tribes, out of Egypt, or when he parted the Red Sea, and he's telling the whole story of who they are. One rock for each of the tribes, and he builds it around the wood, so he's now oriented the 12 tribes around the fire of God. He's retelling the story. He's putting worship back at the center of the whole thing, reminding them who God is and who they were. And he lays the wood and the sacrifice at the center of this altar. And I love this. For no other reason than just to show off, he decides to douse the entire thing in water. Just drench the thing in water so that even if I wanted to catch it on fire, I couldn't. He's basically saying, I want to be sure, and I want everybody else to know that when this thing catches on fire, the only explanation is God. I love that. That's what I want to be true of us as a church. When people come into this church, I want them to walk out saying there is no other explanation for what happened in that place than God showed up. It wasn't somebody's talent. It wasn't the environment. It wasn't the volume of the worship. It was just God showed up. And that's what Elijah wants. He wants to make sure that they know when this thing catches fire, it's because God did it. I couldn't light this thing myself with a match. I couldn't light it with a blowtorch. It's drenched. Only God. And then he prays a simple prayer. He starts off by saying, I'm praying to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We've talked about this before. He's identifying God by relationship. I'm praying to the God of my family, of my fathers, to the God of me. I identify you by relationship. I love the second thing he says in this prayer. He says, please don't make me look stupid. right? Please, please answer so that they'll know that you sent me. Don't make me look stupid. And then he says, essentially, show them who you are and turn their hearts back to you. Capture their hearts again. I love that. He's saying capture their affections again. Capture their love again. Show them who you are. And as he prays this simple prayer, lightning comes out of the sky. It consumes the sacrifice. It consumes the altar. It consumes the stones. It consumes the water. Everything is gone, obliterated, because only God can do this. And then they started to worship because the people had seen who the true God was. I think it's so interesting. Yahweh didn't demand that they slash themselves. He didn't demand that they perform for him or serve him. Just a simple prayer. And then he immediately responds with fire. In the Old Testament, in Exodus, twice we see that fire from God falls on the altar. Once is when they consecrated the temple, or the tabernacle. They built the tabernacle, and it says that fire from God fell to consume, to initiate or to consecrate the tabernacle. The other time was when Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's sons, screwed up and sinned against God, and fire fell and consumed both of them. If you read this story, which one of those two stories out of Exodus and Leviticus does this seem more like? The second one. Here's a group of people that had sinned against God. They had been choosing to live this sort of split life where they would worship God and Baal just kind of as they saw fit. They were idolaters. They had broken God's heart. So in this moment, what would you expect? What could God have done? He could have sent the fire down on them to consume them. He could have, if he wanted to, he could have sent the fire down on the prophets of Baal or on Ahab and Jezebel. But he didn't. Instead, he consumed the altar, the sacrifice on the altar. Why? Because Elijah had asked him to turn their hearts, to capture their hearts and their affections again. This isn't just a power story. This isn't just about Yahweh showing what he's able to do. It's a grace story. He's accepting on their behalf the sacrifice instead of judging them for their idolatry. I'll take the sacrifice to recapture your hearts, to win you back from the gods that you've been serving. I love that. You know, this story pops up in the New Testament. Jesus is on his way. He's preaching the gospel kind of all throughout these towns, and he comes to a Samaritan town. And he sends his disciples ahead of him and says, hey, go tell him I'm coming. And they go to the Samaritan town, and they say, hey, Jesus is coming. He wants to preach in your town. And they say, he can't come to town. He's not allowed to come in. So they come back to Jesus and they say, they won't let you come into town. And two of the disciples, James and John, this is where they get their nickname. They're known as the Sons of Thunder. They go to Jesus and they say, should we call down lightning on them? And many of the translations say, like Elijah did. Several of the manuscripts say, like Elijah did. So should we do what Elijah did? Notice they fundamentally misunderstood the story. Elijah didn't call down fire on the people. God didn't rain down fire on the people who had rejected him. He rained it down on the sacrifice in an act of grace to win their hearts back. And so Jesus, in that moment, rebukes James and John. Why? Because he didn't come and demand that they slash themselves and bleed for him. He didn't come to judge and condemn them, to rain fire down on the sky for those who rejected him. Instead, what? He came to be cut. He came to offer his blood. He came to be the sacrifice on the altar, that the fire of God falls and consumes him, and we receive his reward. And that's how he wins our hearts back. By grace. This story is not just a power story, it's a grace story. It's a story of forgiveness for a group of people who didn't deserve it, who had rejected God over and over and over again, and yet he says, I'm going after your hearts. So I'll take the sacrifice instead of you. Good news in the Old Testament, yeah? Let's pray.